So I'm just going to get straight on and paint. Nice simple autumnal landscape, no real drawing. I'm just going to very simply mark out where I want the horizon to be. So just a line straight across basically. And I'm just going to wet the sky area. I'm just going to use a large mop brush and not covering the whole sheet, just leaving some areas dry, and just so the paint breaks up on that and leaves some white areas behind. And that's going to be the light source for the painting. So I'm going to keep it very simple. I'm just going to use another mop brush, a smaller brush, and just pick up a little bit of blue, there's some cobalt, and I'll put a little bit of cerulean into that as well. I want quite a nice bright blue sky. And so I've got that mixed up quite wet, and just drop that into the wet areas and just bring it down to where I've left some dry areas as well, and then allow that to break up. And so just leaving behind a few little hard edges in the sky. And I'll just go into that little bit of grey I've got left there in the palette and add some ultramarine, a little bit of burnt sienna, a tiny little bit of raw sienna as well, and use some of the blue, the cerulean mix as well, and just mix it all together and get a nice warm grey. And same again really, just lay that down into the wet areas and drag it across the dry areas. So you get a nice contrast between hard and soft edges. And so I want quite an atmospheric feel, sort of loose kind of autumn feel. And so I've mixed a little bit of blue into that grey mix as well now. So that's a slightly cooler grey, and just bring that in from the right hand side. Again, into the wet areas and the dry areas. And now just touch that with some water and bring it down to the horizon. And so it's quite a light, fresh sky. And just tidy up some of those little areas, soften a few of the edges. And now I'm going to continue that mix down across the land. Just squeeze out a little bit more raw sienna. And I'll mix some raw sienna in with the blue I've got up there as well, just to make a little bit of a soft green. And I can touch that into the sky where it's come down to the horizon and allow it to very softly run together. And so a little bit more raw sienna. And so I'm just blocking in the shapes, and I'll bring that round. I want a little bit of a path going off. And just drop a little bit of blue-grey into the path area. And so very roughly marking out where I want everything to be. And I've just dropped a little bit of cadmium yellow in as well, just to get a bit of a green. And so you can be very loose at this stage. And just varying the mix all the time. So just put a bit of burnt sienna in there now and just touch it all together, allow it all to run. Can't really make any mistakes at this stage. And so just laying in all the light areas, and so I've got the bare bones of the painting in now. And I'm just going to dry off this first wash. Okay, it's touch dry, so I'm just going to spray a little bit of water over the horizon. And just grab a little bit of cobalt blue and mix that with what's in the palette there. just so it tones it down. And just very simply lay in a distant hill or tree line and give it another little spritz because I want it to be soft. And a little bit of ultramarine now as well, and burnt sienna, and I can just touch that in as well in places. But not looking for any detail, so just bring it straight across, give it another little spray. And now just continue that all the way over to the left. Now just drop a little bit of burnt sienna in as well, just at the base of that, just so it gives it just a tiny little bit of warmth. And then hopefully that'll look like just like a distant hedgerow or something at the end of this field. And so everything very simply put in at this stage. And now just go into that brown and that blue and just mix it all together. So I've got a bit of a warm grey. And I'll just add a little bit of texture to the land. And so really it's just adding a few little textural notes here and there just to suggest that the land is undulating slightly. And so it's a bit of ultramarine, a little bit more burnt sienna. And I'll just mark out just the edge of the path. And just a few little marks across the land. A lot of this will be covered up in the finished painting, but it's just getting it in early just so I know where I'm going. And a little bit more texture in the path. And now just darken off that little bit of land on the right hand side. Now I'll grab a little bit more blue, a little bit more burnt sienna. And just use the side of the brush, just put in a few tree shapes just at the end of the field. Again, quite a lot of that's going to be covered up. So you don't have to be too accurate with it. And a little bit more burnt sienna, and just do the same on the right hand side, just at the edge of the field there. Very simple tree shapes, just allowing the brush to do all the work really. And while it's still wet, just drop in a tiny little bit of darker paint just to connect the left and the right. Okay, and I think I'll just dry that again. Now just mix up some burnt sienna, some raw sienna, and just to get a nice sort of warm autumnal colour. And I'll put a little bit of a mist across the sky area because I want this tree to soften off. So I'm just gone back to the small mop brush, and I'm just using the side of the brush, just start at the top of the tree and work my way down. And so just drag the brush across the paper, allow the paint to sort of grab the tooth and break up a tiny little bit. And just varying the mix again with a little bit of blue, a little bit more raw sienna in there. And just drop that into the wet paint and continue the wash down. And so there'll be about 2 or 3 little trees here, but I'd just like to treat them all as one big shape. And so a little bit more cobalt blue into that. And just give it another little mist, and a little mist on the left hand side now. And so there's some trees a little bit further away. Same sort of thing, so just use the side of the brush and drag that down. And again, there'll be 2 or 3, maybe 4 trees there, but just treat it all as one big mass. So a little bit more burnt sienna, a little bit more ultramarine. And I'll just darken on the right hand side there. And that helps push the distance back a little bit as well. So even more ultramarine. I can now lay that in to the wet paint of the tree. And it just suggests some shadowy areas. And I can start to touch some of that across the land now. Again, just using the side of the brush. And same thing on the left hand side now. I can continue that wash down all the way down to the land. And I'll just pick up the rigger brush. And so a little bit more ultramarine, a bit more burnt sienna, and just mix up a dark. And I can just add a little bit of texture now across the land. So I can start getting a few harder edges in there now. And the mixture of hard and soft edges just helps to tie everything together. And again, just outlining the path and getting a few little bits of texture in the land now, a few hard edges in the foreground. And I'll just put a few tree trunks in now. And where the paint's touching the wet, it softens, and then the little dry bits in between, you get a few hard edges. And just flick out a few little, maybe that's a tree with no leaves on it there on the right hand side. And even darker paint now, and I'll move over to the tree on the right hand side. So just bring the trunk up, and the paint is still a little bit wet here as well, so it will soften on the wet areas, and then I'll get some hard edges on the dry parts. And like I said, 2 or 3 little trees in there. And really just looking at the overall shape, just trying to make it a pleasing shape. And I can drop a little bit more dark in because the paint is still wet. And so just strengthen the shadowy areas. The light's coming from behind the tree, so get some nice strong shadow areas. And just darken that little tree or bush there on the right. I just grabbed a little bit of cobalt blue, so it's a slightly grayer paint now, and just put a little bit of texture in on those distant trees. And maybe that's a little scrubby hedgerow there. Don't want to have too much detail in the distance. And I'll just darken this little copse of trees there, just on the left hand side. And that kind of helps to create a bit of a stopper so the eye doesn't drift out of the side of the painting. I'm just going to mix up a shadow colour now. So I've got some cobalt blue, and some raw sienna. And I'm going to put the shadows in which is essentially just a darker version of the colour in the land. So just adding some blue into some raw sienna gets me roughly where I want to be. So I can bring that across the land quite wet. Taking a little bit of care just to leave some of the previous wash behind. I don't want to completely cover it up. And that hopefully just look like a little bit of dappled light. And because the light's coming from behind, so the trees are going to cast a shadow straight towards us. Don't have to be too literal about it. It doesn't have to be like an exact kind of like mirror image. It's not a reflection. I just darken that slightly with a bit of ultramarine and bring it all the way across the foreground. So very simply put in, but that does help to push the distance back even further as well. So I'll go back into that dark I've still got in the palette. And I'll just flick out a few branches in that bush on the right hand side. And I'll just lay that into the wet shadow as well. And just allow that to sort of run in, and that will soften nicely on its own. But it's all adding texture. And again, having the darks in the foreground, it helps with perspective and to push the distance back. And so working very loosely and pure watercolour, so no messing around with any gouache or anything like that, and just trying to preserve the whites. But a thing you can do, you can use a plastic card, or you could use a pen knife or a palette knife as well, but just to scrape out just a few little areas and get some highlights, so it helps to reveal some of the paper underneath. And it's quite a nice way to get some highlights into your paintings without having to resort to any opaque paint. But you have to take care, don't do too much of this. It is quite a nice little effect, but too much can really be quite overpowering, so do exercise a little bit of restraint. But it's just a few little areas, little highlights. I'm just looking at the big tree there. I think it needs a little bit of strengthening. It's a little bit too thin. So I'll just mix up a little bit more dark paint, and I'll just thicken that trunk a little bit, just to make it look a little bit more solid. And the paint is still a little bit wet in the tree wash anyway, so that is softening quite nicely. I'm using a piece of Arche paper, £140. It's cold press, if anybody's interested. And so I don't want to do too much with this tree. It's just strengthening it, making it look a little bit bolder. And I'll add a little bit more dark just at the base of that. And I'll just touch a couple little bit more dark areas just into the foreground, and some little tracks on the path there. But again, less is more really. I don't want to do too much of that. Don't want to overwork it. And I'll just scratch out a couple of little highlights just in that trunk where I've just put that in. So all very simply done. Okay, let's finish painting. I'll just take the tape off so you can have a look with a nice white edge, give you a rough idea of what it might look like in a mount. And so it's a very simple demonstration there. Autumnal scene, pure watercolour, no tricks or hacks or gimmicks or anything like that, just straight in with the brush, pretty much just laying in a very rough horizon line and then straight in with the paint. I hope you like that. If you've got any questions, let me know in the comments. You can follow me on Patreon if you don't already, and I've got a membership on YouTube as well where there's some exclusive content that's not on regular YouTube, so do give me a follow over there. Also, the help I receive from people on Patreon really does help me keep making these videos. Obviously it's quite costly exercise, so any help that anybody's willing to give me is always very greatly appreciated. I'll be back again next week with another video, so do tag me in your pictures on Instagram, Facebook and social media and all that kind of stuff. And I'll see you next week. Cheers then. Bye for now.